Welcome to the third lecture in our 6th week of Church History 500 and our beta lecture series. And in this lecture, we're going to tackle Germanic Christianity, one of my favorites. And as a result of this lecture, I would expect that the student explore the transition from barbarian Arianism that dominated the Germanic lands, Europe, to Nicene Orthodoxy. The student will examine the various centers of Germanic Christianity, the differences, the similarities, the relationships between them. And the student will explore the contributions of Germanic Christianity. So our discussion of Germanic Christianity actually starts with barbarian Christianity. And we have to go back to the death of Augustine and the situation in the Roman Empire. Rome is falling, or at least it's weakening, right? And we have Vandals that were coming down from Europe into North Africa and were laying siege to Augustine's city of Hippo. And Alaric and the Goths had already sacked Rome. At this point, the Roman Empire had already been thoroughly Christianized. After the Council of Nicaea, that Christianity, at least on a political level, took on this Arian flavor. But by the 5th century, most of that was replaced with Nicene Orthodoxy. Constantine had legalized Christianity when he came to power in AD 312, but it was Emperor Theodosius that made it the official religion in AD 380. But even by AD 380, these barbarian tribes were growing in number and strength. And if you recall our discussion of the Romans had this thesis statement for their empire: to rule mankind and make the world obey. And this is what drove the Romans to push around the Mediterranean and push into Persia, push through North Africa, push into Europe so that they could rule all peoples. However, by this time, the Roman Empire had become so large, so hard to administer, that they were having a hard time dealing with the growing number of barbarian tribes that lay on their borders. And the Romans had always had a hard time with these barbarian tribes. And it dates all the way back to 390 BC, when these Gallic Celtic tribes invaded the Italian boot by coming over the Alps. And the Romans didn't think that these barbarians even could come over the Alps, but when they did, these Celts were terrifying, at least to the Romans. Their bodies were painted. They would strip down their clothes when going to battle. They would yell out this barbaric cry, and then they literally would hop on their sleds and slide down the snow like naked snowboarding Celts in order to engage the Romans in battle. And the Romans were very orderly. And to the Romans, these Celts looked like they were insane, and they didn't know what to do with them. Actually, the Romans were never defeated the Celts. They're the only barbarian tribe they never had a chance to defeat. They avoided them. So even when the Romans pushed into Britain, they built Hadrian's Wall to keep those crazy Celts on the other side because they didn't want to deal with them. So the Romans never knew what to do with crazy people, which they associated with barbarians. If you don't know what a barbarian is, we use it, to refer to uncivilized people today. And the Romans did use it with that sense, but they had a more specific sense. The barbarians were the people that didn't speak Latin. And to an ancient Roman, these barbarian tribes just sounded like they were saying barbar, like they didn't understand their language at all, so they called them barbarians. But there's a wrinkle in the story of the barbarians. The barbarians were originally pagan, but all but one of the major tribes had become Christianized by the 4th or 5th century. And as an example, Ulfilas, a Cappadocian Christian, was sent to the Goths by Emperor Constantius II. I don't expect you to remember this, but Constantius II was actually one of the Arian emperors of the Roman Empire. So when he commissioned Ulfius as a missionary, he commissioned him as an Arian missionary. So Ulfius took Christianity to the Goths, but converted them to Arian Christianity. Ulfius did a number of other amazing things, though. One of the things that made them barbarian is they had no written language. So Ulfius invented a Gothic alphabet and a Gothic language so that the Bible could be translated into Old Gothic, right? So interestingly, when Rome was under siege by these barbarian tribes were actually Christian tribes. So it has led historians to ask the logical question, is this the collapse of the Christian world, or is this just a change or a shift in the Christian world? I think it's helpful to remember that the Goths, Vandals, Burgundians, Lombardians, Ostrogoths, they were all Arian Christians. So when Nicaea I don't want to say outlawed Arian Christianity, but they rejected Arian Christianity. According to Nicaea, well, no, they weren't really Christians. They may have been Arian, but they weren't truly Christian because they did not subscribe to the Nicene Creed. Shortly after the Nicene Council, Arian Christianity survived, especially among the politicians, Constantius II. So, yeah, it is a very interesting conversation. Were these barbarian tribes Christian, or were they something else? But there was one group of barbarians that accepted Christianity relatively late that would have a tremendous influence on the other barbarian tribes, and their story gets entangled with the story of British Christianity, and that is the Franks. The Franks were a barbarian group that gave France its name, right? As the Burgundians gave Burgundy, the Lombardians gave Lombardy its name, Franks gave France its name. And they retained their paganism while all the other all the other barbarian tribes had accepted Christianity. But the first great Frankish king, Clovis, who ruled around AD 481 to 511, married a Christian Burgundian princess who was actually Nicene Orthodox. She was not Arian. So this converted Clovis not just to Christianity, but to Nicene Orthodox Christianity, and the rest of the Franks came along with them. In class, we'll discuss whether or not mass conversions like this are true conversions, but there's no reason to doubt that many of them were Christian, even if not all of them were Christian, that accepted Christianity as a result of Clovis. And the Franks became the dominant barbarian, now Orthodox Christian group in Europe, and they started to incorporate the Burgundians and Lombardians and all that, and promoting and imposing Nicene Orthodoxy at times. And the most famous of these Frankish kings was Charles the Great, who we know as Charlemagne. And after the breakdown of the Roman Empire, Europe fractured into various tribes, and it didn't have any central authority. And Rome had become used to having this privileged position, not just in power, but responsibility. They gave an infrastructure to Europe, to the Mediterranean, North Africa, that was legal infrastructure, economic infrastructure, infrastructure proper when it comes to like roads and sewage and rulers and all that sort of thing. When Rome faded and these tribes began to dominate the scene in Europe, that infrastructure disappeared. But as the story goes, on Christmas Day in AD 800, Charlemagne was celebrating Mass in Rome, and completely by surprise, according to the story at least, Pope Leo III placed a crown on Charlemagne's head. Charlemagne had conquered a good chunk of what was that western third of the Roman Empire, and a little bit of that middle third. And Pope Leo III crowned him as the Holy Roman Empire, the Christian Roman Emperor, right? The guy who was supposed to rebuild the glory of Rome. Now that would become a problem going forward, because if the Pope crowns the king, who's more powerful? Well, then the Pope is more powerful. So when Charlemagne passed his crown on to his sons, he made sure he did it so that he didn't have to answer to a Pope. So while Charlemagne benefited from papal endorsement, it didn't start the rivalry between secular authority and the church, but this symbolized the rivalry between secular authority and the church that continues really to this day. Why is it that a lot of these pedophiles in the Catholic Church were not tried and convicted in civil courts? This is a part of that discussion, right? But at this point in the story of Germanic Christianity, we have to put a pin in it, and we have to rewind a little bit to talk about Christianity in Britain, because it will help us coordinate these two as we go forward. So British Christianity, at least the traditions that surround it, actually put it as one of the earliest Christian contexts outside of Jerusalem. There is this tradition that after Jesus' death and resurrection, Joseph of Arimathea, who provided the tomb for Jesus for 3 days, it's taken the Holy Grail that Jesus used at the Last Supper and brought it to England, brought it to Glastonbury. I'm pretty sure most historians don't put a whole lot of stock in that particular story, but it does tell us a little bit about how the British viewed themselves, right, as being one of the original heirs to the Christian tradition. But believe it or not, it is clear that that Christianity reaching Britain early was a possibility. If you remember, in AD 49, when Claudius was emperor, there was this debate between the Jews in Rome, the faction that followed Chrestus, and Claudius had to expel these Christians. And over the next century, these Christians expelled from Rome started to travel, right? Over the next century, these Christians traveled with the Roman army to Britannia. They came as merchants to sell their goods in Londinium and created a Christian community there. And St. Peter's Cornhill in London, a church that still exists today, claims to be the earliest church in London, in Britain, going back to AD 179. So specific churches trace their history back to the 2nd century, reflecting an organized Christianity in Britain very early. About a century later, we have more evidence of a Christian community starting to thrive in Britain. Believe it or not, it was during the universal persecutions under Diocletian. And those persecutions reached Britain. One of my favorite stories is the story of the first martyr of Britain, St. Albans. And Alban was a resident of Verulamium, a Roman town just north of London. Today is known as the town of St. Albans. But Verulamium was a Roman town, incredibly well preserved today. To jump off my notes, I had a chance to visit there, and they have a Roman museum, they have Roman ruins, Roman theater. I actually have a video on my personal YouTube channel that chronicles all the things I saw there. Well worth your time if you ever get there. Not sure the video is well worth your time, but you're free to check that out if you want. But Alban was a resident of Roman Verulamium, and there was this Christian monk, Amphibolus, that was being hunted by the Roman soldiers to be persecuted, and he knocked on the door of Alban, who was not a Christian, but Alban had compassion and brought him in, sheltered him. But then when the Roman soldiers came knocking on Alban's door, what Alban did is he put on the monk's habit, the monk's robes, and presented himself as Amphibolus, and he was put on trial, convicted, and brought to his execution. And it's clear by his testimony, and we read this in Bede's Ecclesiastical History, that Alban actually embraced Christianity. Alban was threatened, you either sacrifice to the pagan gods or we'll execute you. And Alban's response was, I worship and adore the true and living God who created all things. So as the story goes, St. Alban was being led to his execution site and couldn't get there because the onlookers had blocked the bridge, and Alban wanted his execution to go by expeditiously. He didn't want to have to wait, so he looked to heaven and the river dried up, and him and his executioners were able to walk across to the top of the hill at Verulamium for him to be beheaded. And as the story goes, he was beheaded and his head rolled down the hill, and where it came to a stop, a spring sprung, a fountain sprung up. And like I said before with Paul, it's hard to know how much credence to put in stories like this. To the modern ear, it's ridiculous. To the Christian ear that allows for the possibility of miracles, it's not ridiculous, but it's unlikely. But it is kind of interesting that we have all of these fountain stories associated especially with beheadings. And you can go to the Well of St. Albans today at the bottom of the hill from where the cathedral is, which is the site of his execution. So I just appreciate the story today. I appreciated being able to visit St. Albans. But what this story says for our purposes was that not only did Christianity take root very early, pretty far away from Jerusalem, they were deeply committed to the faith and were willing to die. Ironically, one of the most famous British Christians, other than Pelagius, he's not a great representative of British Christianity, but one of the most famous Christians from Britain wasn't actually from Britain. The General Constantine had his army stationed in Britain when Diocletian's tetrarchy started to unravel, and he marched on Rome and converted before taking Rome and became the first Christian emperor of Rome. So Britain does have this very close connection to Christianity, to even Roman Christianity. But as a result of this seismic shift in the Roman Empire Constantine inaugurated, as a result of the collapse of this Roman influence throughout Europe, throughout the Mediterranean, the German barbarian tribes were on the move. And we discussed a number of Christian tribes. We discussed the Franks, who were pagan and converted. One tribe that fled from the Christian tribes that retained their paganism, well, two actually, were the Angles and the Saxons, who left Germany and actually came to Britain. They were actually invited into Britain to help the Britons get rid of this other enemy, and the Angles and Saxons just kind of stayed there with their paganism. So around the 4th century, late 4th century, Britain entered this period where Christianity was shoved to its margins while the Angles and Saxons, or the Anglo-Saxons as we call them, reintroduced paganism into Britain. And while Anglo-Saxonism reintroduced paganism, Christianity was actually preserved in Ireland. And most of us have heard the story of St. Patrick and the driving out of the snakes. That is actually not the most important part about St. Patrick's story, but in the interest of time, we'll leave it there. But we do have to recognize one of the central institutions, most influential institutions that Irish Christianity promoted was the monastery, especially the monastery on Iona. And the monastery at Iona was founded by St. Columba, and in this monastery they preserved classical learning, Roman education, especially Aristotle. That would be preserved also by the Muslims after it had fallen out of favor in the Roman Empire as a whole, but it was preserved in Iona, which also preserved classical learning as well as pagans. And it wasn't just Iona, but Iona has a significant influence because not only was it a center of learning, it became a missional center, sending out a number of missionaries that sought to reintroduce Christianity into Anglo-Saxon Britain. And in the early 7th century, Aidan was sent from Ireland, sent from Iona, to convert the kings of Northumbria, just below where Scotland is today. And his work was very successful, and he founded a cathedral on the island of Lindisfarne, and you can still see ruins of that cathedral today. But while Irish missionaries like Aidan were introducing an Irish brand of Christianity in the north of Britain, a Roman missionary was ministering in southern Britannia. And as the story goes, Pope Gregory the Great was walking through the city of Rome and was passing through the slave market, and he sees this very fair-skinned, blonde-haired, blue-eyed boy for auction at the slave market, and he asked one of his assistants, what sort of man is this? What sort of boy is this? And the assistant said, well, he's an Angle, an Anglo-Saxon. And Gregory the Great is reported by the Venerable Bede to say, oh no, he's not so much Angle as he is Angeli, an angel. So Gregory the Great developed this burden for Britannia and commissioned Augustine, not Augustine of Hippo that we spend a lot of time on, different Augustine. I would imagine the guy named after Augustine of Hippo, Augustine of Canterbury, as he would become known. And he sent Augustine of Canterbury, who had his own missionaries like Paulinus that was traveling around southern Britain. And the more that these Christian brands spread, the more that we see areas of friction between them. We have this northern brand of Christianity that was rooted, kind of like North Africans, in personal holiness as its main organizing principle. And you have this different brand promoted by Roman missionaries where the institution seems to be more central to its character. But one thing that unites these two brands, that both these brands shared, was a commitment to scholarship. And we see this in Iona and the preservation of classical learning. We see this in what Augustine of Canterbury brought to southern Britain. And Augustine brought two international scholars, Theodore and Hadrian. Theodore of Tarsus, this Greek-speaking Christian who was molded by the Cappadocians, right? And this Latin-speaking African, Hadrian, to begin a training school in Canterbury. And this school produced a number of biblical commentaries. Well, at the same time, we have Iona. We have smaller monasteries in the north of England, like Jarrow, where the Venerable Bede would write his ecclesiastical history as a different center of learning. And during this era of Britain's emerging Christianity, we see this explosion not only of learning and training, but literature. Right? Not just biblical commentaries and philosophical treatises on Aristotle, but poems like The Dream of the Rood, The Wanderer, Beowulf. A lot of secular literature people say that Beowulf is the only surviving form of an old pagan epic poem that was Christianized at some point along the way. And you know what? It's possible that that's true, but we have no versions of it that existed in this old pagan form. In fact, every piece of evidence seems to point to the fact that this was a Christian attempt at presenting Christianity as compatible with these Anglo-Saxon values. So we have this one thing that unites them. They had a number of things that divided Northern Irish from Southern Roman Christian culture. And in AD 664, they had to hold a synod at Whitby to iron out the differences between these two brands of Christianity. We won't spend any time on what the actual points of contention were, because to our ears they sound kind of silly. How to date Easter, how to shave the tonsure. The tonsure is how monks would shave their head to demonstrate their submission to God, and The Roman brand would shave like the circle at the crown of the, well, not the crown, but the back of the head. The Irish version would draw a line from ear to ear and shave everything forward. I think we're all kind of glad that the Roman version won out on that one. The other one seems a little bizarre. But now we had this hybrid compromise brand of Christianity post Synod of Whitby. And there was one northern Christian monk who would champion this new unified vision for Christianity in Britain. And I will admit a great level of bias in claiming that he is the most significant British saint, and that is St. Cuthbert, right? St. Cuthbert would eventually go on to succeed Eiden as the prior of Lindisfarne, and he has an amazing story behind him. There is a pilgrim way that you can walk tracing St. Cuthbert's journeys today that I have a video about later, but unfortunately we'll have to skip a lot of that. This emerging British Christian culture emphasized scholarship, biblical scholarship, philosophical scholarship, proto-scientific scholarship that would actually help feed the church on the continent, feed the church in Europe. Because Britain became a sending post for missionaries. One great example of this is Winfrid. And he lived between AD 675 and 754, so late 7th, early 8th century. Winfrid was educated in Britain and went to minister in Frisia, but then Frisia got caught up in this war with the Franks, and Winfrid had to return to Britain. So the following year, Winfrid went to Rome and was appointed by Pope Gregory II as the apostle to the Germans and renamed St. Boniface. Well, Boniface, he would be declared a saint later. And Boniface ministered under the protection of the Frankish king Charles the Hammer Martel, right? And he worked among the Saxons. And the Christian church grew very rapidly among the Saxons that stayed in Germany, right? Rapid enough that he was appointed archbishop, and he saw several dioceses crop up all around Germany. And a generation after Boniface, we have the translation of the Gospels into Old Saxon, a translation known as the Heliand. And the term Heliand is this Old Saxon word for the Savior. And this is a fascinating read, because it's not just a translation of Latin words into Old Saxon words. It's a translation of the gospel into Saxon culture. And yes, that causes as many problems as it solves. And it presents Jesus as the Saxon hero whose disciples, his loyal thanes, were committed to him, to show that Jesus is really the best of all the Saxons, right? And in class we'll go over one particular story that illustrates some of the cool parts about this and the problems with it, right? Another different type of missionary from Britain was Alcuin of York. He was a member of the clergy, but he was more of a scholar. And he was brought from Britain by Charlemagne into the Frankish courts to help promote the style of British scholarship and Christian learning that Britain was known for. Alcuin was a polymath. He was a mathematician, a theologian, a man of letters, quite literally, actually. Because Alcuin is credited with the development of the minuscule script. We would call it lowercase. So before this, everything in Latin was uppercase. Not only was it uppercase, it did not divide between words or sentences. There was no punctuation. Alcuin didn't invent all that, but he did invent a lowercase script, which made it easier to read. More importantly, easier to copy. Easier to copy meant that there were more more copies of the Bible and other texts that were able to be made in a shorter period of time at a cheaper cost, further spreading this knowledge. And the scholarly innovations that Alcuin introduced allowed Charlemagne and the Holy Roman Empire up into the 19th century to remain not just a force, but a Christian force. Throughout the medieval period, it helped shape the Reformation, although more in a negative way. It became a Catholic fortress under the Habsburgs in the 18th century. The Holy Roman Empire was only dissolved August 6, 1806. That's amazing. So thanks to the Franks, thanks to the Britons, German Christianity became an extension of Nicene Orthodoxy. It wasn't a heretical or a heterodox branch of Christianity. It was the result of the triumph of the Council of Nicaea. And the Christian world that was built in Britain and Germany would set the course of the church for over a millennium and actually spread to most corners of the world. But we're going to have to wait quite a while for some of those lectures. Thank you.